Okay, hello YouTube. Today I'm going to be going over another rook and pawn endgame that I think is really important for understanding the basics of rook and pawn endgames and understanding the principles behind rook and pawn endgames. So if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, hit that subscribe button and click on that notification icon. So as you all probably know already, as a good general rule is you want your rook behind your passed pawn. But in a lot of rook and pawn endgames, that's not always possible. A lot of times, an enemy rook will get behind your passed pawn, and you'll be forced to defend it by either going in front or going to the side. And of course, this is less than ideal, but we do what we have to do when we're trying to win a position. And of course, the least ideal circumstance is when you have, your passed h pawn and you have your rook in front of it. But a lot of these endgames are in fact winnable, even with your rook in front of the pawn. Because an overriding principle is just get that pawn up the board as far as you possibly can, and the further you get it up the board, the better. Now, this particular endgame has a very special rule behind it. When you have a rook pawn that's advanced all the way to the 6th rank, it's very important not to advance it any further. And this very basic position kind of demonstrates exactly why. For starters, you need a spot to hide your king. And that h7 square is going to be the only place where you can possibly hide your king. Now, the h-pawn is notoriously difficult to queen because the black king has to be ridiculously far away to make queening the h-pawn possible. If the black king is even cut off by the rook and the king is supporting the pawn, but the king is only cut off by, say, 4 ranks or something like that, black can still get a book draw. It's not actually possible to win. So it's kind of an amazing thing about the rook pawn. But with the rook in front of the pawn like this, there is kind of this restriction on how far the king can move if the king already happens to be hovering between these two squares, hovering between this h7 and g7 square. Because let's say, for example, I play the correct move here, which is king d4, and I'm kind of aiming for shelter, and they play rook d2 check, and I play something like king e5, and they play rook e2 check, and I just go for that square. At no point can this king ever venture outside of this little pocket. If this king were to go to, say, f3 at any point, I could push this pawn down, I could play check, and I could gain another tempo with my pawn. Actually, even with the pawn on the 6th rank, you can play check and then gain another tempo. If the rook isn't directly behind the pawn, that pawn is going to make a queen. So the king is stuck. The king is kind of stuck in this holding pattern over here. And that holding pattern is actually a very serious problem. So just going again with the winning method here, we would play check, we would eventually hide. So now the king can kind of start walking over here, because now we're supporting this pawn firmly with our king. But this king is very, very far away. He won't be able to get into drawing position in time in order to stop us from queening, and that's what makes this position winnable. So for example, rook f2, we could play rook g8, rook h2, rook g5, just bring the rook back, rook d2, king g6, and we're going to be moving up. And eventually we go here, and now all we have to do is just kind of approach the rook, and we're going to have this easy win because this pawn is going to go up and make a queen. And generally speaking, that's the method. So, something like this, we would simply approach the rook, we make a queen on the next move, and we win. And if black had ventured closer with his king a little bit earlier, it wouldn't have made any difference. He just wasn't close enough to get the job done. Now, if we go back to this initial kind of starting position here, and we go back to here, white can lose this very, very easily by eliminating his hiding square. If he eliminates that h7 square, he can no longer get a draw. So if we were to play pawn to h7 right here, major question mark, this would be an easy draw for black. Black could simply check, and then he could just start bringing his king over, and then he could easily just shuffle his rook back to h1. Now, as long as this king shuffles back and forth between g2 and h2, black won't lose. Now, if any point the king ventures further than that, like if the king goes to here, like if the king goes to c7, we are going to be completely lost because that rook will shuffle over to a8, and there's this cute tactic where we can actually pick up this rook if the rook tries to take the pawn. So a major mistake even here would be if my king just ventures over, just making, progress. Here we can just easily obtain a draw just by checking the white king to death. White cannot get out of these checks. It's going to be a very easy draw. But if we make this error, if we play something like here, this rook can come over, and now we're actually protecting that pawn via this threat. So as long as the king, like I said, shuffles between these two squares, and the pawn has advanced too far, meaning all the way to the 7th rank, this position is now unwinnable. But if the pawn hangs out at the 6th rank, this position is still very winnable. So now we're going to take a look at one more example of this. And that example comes from a Bobby Fischer game. This game was played between Samuel Reshevsky and Robert James Fischer. And we're going to fast forward to kind of this critical position right here, where Rook A3 had just been played by Sammy Reshevsky, and as you can see, we're putting a lot of pressure on this pawn here. And White has an interesting choice to make, like what should White do to improve his position? Now, what Sammy Reshevsky did with the white pieces in this position was actually a huge mistake. So grandmasters misplay these positions all the time. He got his rook out of the way of the pawn. And you don't really have time to do this. You don't have time to play a move like rook c6 and get the rook out of the way of the pawn to push the pawn up the board. Why? Because when you have your rook in front of the pawn, sometimes the best thing to do is just push that pawn up the board. It's not a big deal that your rook is in front of the pawn. It's more important to get that pawn further up the board. Even if it's, a bad pawn, even if it's, your rook pawn, it's more important to just get that pawn further up the board. Now, in this case, Sammy Reshevsky's pawn isn't a terrible pawn. Like this b pawn is actually a very good pawn, and it's very dangerous. He is down a pawn here, but this is, again, one of those situations where it doesn't really matter how many pawns you have. What matters is how far up the board they are. Now, if he had played b5, he could have very easily saved a draw here. White can get a draw because he's making enough threats that eventually black will have to sacrifice for these pawns. So for example, g5, we would have hg5, hg5. The rook would just shuffle down, and this is one of those situations. We don't have enough time to get the rook behind the pawn. We just need to keep the rook in front of the pawn and just push these pawns up the board as fast as we can. Nothing else really matters all that much other than getting these pawns up the board. So now g4, and now we do have time to check from behind so that we're threatening to make a queen with b6, b7, b8. So white can play rook f8 check, king e5, and then b6 is the critical idea. We shove this pawn up the board. We use the chuck and run method. We're going to chuck that a pawn, and we're going to run with the only pawn that matters, which is the b pawn. And that b pawn is going to run. And this would have been the method, not to win for white, but to hold a draw. Because now black, at some point, is going to be forced to sacrifice for this pawn when the pawn makes a queen. And fortunately for black would have enough pawns left. In Fischer's case, black would have enough pawns left that white cannot take all 3 pawns with his rook. He can't corral them. And so this position should actually just be equal. Eventually, if black continues to advance his pawns and white is very careful about his rook moves, black should eventually become kind of stumped here and just run out of moves that make progress. But white still has to be very careful all the way up until the very end on how exactly he proceeds. Like, even if you get to this point right here, white has to be very cautious that he doesn't take the pawn on f3 with check, which would actually be a mistake. If you play rook f3 check here, question mark, king d4 is actually winning, because now one of these pawns will queen. The king covers the e3 square, so the rook can't cover the e pawn, and if the king goes to f2, simply one pawn queens, and then the other pawn queens, and then the king and queen versus king and rook endgame is a win for black. So here, we would have to play very carefully and just basically just rain down checks on black. The only place black could find shelter would be on the e1 square, but then after rook f7, the position is just completely equal, and that would be a very easy draw. So after rook a3, rook c6 was a mistake, and this allowed Fischer to play for a win because now he's able to chuck his pawns further down the board. This was just one tempo that white could not afford to lose. He needed to just push his pawns as rapidly as possible. This allowed Fischer to get his pawns just an inch further, and that 1 inch was just all it took. He was able to convert this into a full point by combining queening threats with mate threats, and the pawns just aren't far enough. Fischer didn't take either one of Reshevsky's pawns, and Reshevsky's pawns are too far away. Fischer's pawns get there first, and that's all that actually matters here. So after rook f8 check, we have king e4, rook takes f4, he sacrifices the pawn, and then he plays b7, and then Fischer just made a queen and eventually won. He had a very easy win here, though. He had the move king e4, which actually is going to be forced mate. So that was the very simple win. So that's how you handle it when your rook is in front of your pawn. Don't waste 3 tempos trying to get your rook behind the pawn. Instead, push that pawn as far as you can up the board to make progress. In the case of a rook pawn, there is a limit. You push it to the 6th rank, and then you can still win from there. With other pawns, just chuck them up the board as far as you can. Don't waste time to get your rook from in front of them. Those are 3 tempos that in most rook and pawn endgames you cannot afford to lose. So anyways, I hope that you found this video helpful. I hope that you can use some of these ideas in your own game, and I hope that you learned something new about chess. Thank you very much for watching.